And here we go.
Welcome to the Great Work Insights podcast by the O.C. Tanner Institute, the show that features the people, the professionals, the thought leaders, and the coolest companies. And now your host, the man navigating the discussion about the culture, the organized chaos, and the best practices that compel great work, Todd Nordstrom.
What is work? What does the word work mean to you? I was at a social gathering over the weekend where I reconnected with a bunch of old friends. As I began talking to each of the people about their lives, the city they live in, their families, and their jobs, I started thinking about how the word work really means a lot of different things to different people. Here I was in a room with a bunch of people who really did a lot of different things at work. I made a list of the professions in the room. I was with a couple lawyers, a retail manager, an audio production manager, a liquor distributor, a film editor, a contractor, a tennis pro, a software representative, a fitness studio owner, a finance professional, a logistic manager, a medical devices rep, and an HR executive. Plus there's me, a content director. The word work to all of us meant something extremely different. But here's the funny thing. As I asked each person, well, how's work? I received a similar answer. The answer was, it's really busy right now. So then I started thinking, well, that's interesting as well. The word busy. Of course, being busy is good for business, right? Right? Having too many clients, too many things going on, and so much to do that we can't see an end in sight means companies are moving in the right direction, right? After leaving the social gathering, I was sitting at the airport and I overheard another conversation that made me again think about the word work and what it means to be busy. A woman was on her phone and speaking too loudly, I should say, about how she can't seem to make it through her email inbox, how she's always in meetings, and how at the end of her busy day, most of the work she actually produces happens at home, away from work. How many of you can relate to that? And is this the way our work is going to be in the future? Has technology changed our work to the point where we spend our time communicating, organizing, scheduling, and responding rather than actually doing our work? Our guest today can shed some light on the frustration that many of us are feeling. Mike Arauz works for a company called August, a company founded with the belief that today's most valuable work depends on teams of people who work well together. And unfortunately, August also understands that the way most organizations operate in today's world hinder our work instead of supporting it. Mike, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really happy to be here.
I want to jump into this frustration that I think we all feel, where it feels like we're running ourselves ragged during the workday and then coming home and going, but I didn't get any work done. I also want to talk about how work is changing, and I want to talk about what companies and leaders can do to minimize frustration for employees. But before we do that, explain a little bit about what you do and what August does. What do you do for companies? What do you help them do?
Yeah, and so all of the stuff that you were just talking about, that is why we exist. So, the heart of our work is really about how organizations can learn to thrive in the face of uncertainty. And we stress that because I think that sense of uncertainty and how our world is increasingly defined by uncertainty is what has created that situation that everyone is feeling that you were just describing. So our work is about, what does it take for a group of people, oftentimes tens or even hundreds of thousands of people across a corporation spread out all over the world. What does it take for them to work together to sense and quickly respond to the constant changes around us? And most organizations today, especially big established ones, are still using an outdated operating model that was designed over 100 years ago for a world that no longer exists. And this legacy model is optimized for certainty. It's optimized for control, for reliability, for predictability. And unfortunately, these same practices that helped companies succeed in the 20th century are preventing companies from succeeding today. We help companies change from that old model to a new model that will help them thrive in the decades ahead.
That's interesting, and it must be deep work. I don't know if deep is the right word for that, but because that's a culture thing and a process thing, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting. It's very much about culture, and yet our approach tends to be we kind of use we use process and we use speed and these more I think traditional business focused outcomes as our foot in the door for this. And then what happens is that after we start introducing many of these practices, they discover that the culture begins to change, and that culture change is needed in order to adopt and be good at these new ways of working.
Yeah, that's interesting. Most listeners right now are probably listening to this conversation, and there's probably light bulbs glaring in their brains, because I think the frustration we're all aware of. Maybe we just can't put a finger on why we're frustrated. Explain this to me. Is there a bigger issue at play here? What makes today's workplace any more frustrating than 20 years ago? Shouldn't we have gotten better?
Yeah, I wish that was the case. Certainly isn't what most of us are feeling, though. And the reality is that while digital technology certainly isn't the only thing that's changed, it has been by far the most significant factor in how work has changed. And this is why we keep coming back to this idea of certain versus uncertain, certainty versus uncertainty, and the difference between certain work versus uncertain work. And so if you imagine a spectrum where you've got certain work on the left and uncertain work on the right. And so on the left, under certain, you've got the most routine stuff, the stuff where it's very well known how to do it right. For example, boxing up widgets on an assembly line, doing basic accounting, even drawing up very standard legal documents. And then over on the right, in the uncertain end of the spectrum, that's the least routine, the most complex and creative stuff, the stuff that we don't know how to do because it's never been done before. And this includes big world-changing stuff like curing cancer and inventing a self-driving car. But it also includes things like picking the best new IT system for a mid-sized business. Yeah. That problem and the solutions around it change so quickly, so often, that it is nearly impossible to predict what the right answer is going to be. And most organizations who still use that legacy operating model are optimized to be really good at the certain end of the spectrum.
Sure, zero defect kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But guess what? That's what computers are good at, right?
Yeah.
Computers excel at tackling the most routine and most certain problems. That's their specialty. And they're steadily eating jobs and work along this spectrum from that certain end faster and faster towards the uncertain end. So when we think about what is the role of humans in the future of work, the place where we can really make the biggest impact, where we can create the most value, is at the uncertain end of the spectrum. But in order for us to excel in an uncertain environment, we need to change the mindsets and behaviors that inform the way that we work together.
That's got to be fascinating, and it just to walk into companies and I'm sure when you go into companies you divide it up and say, here's the stuff, here's the certain work, now let's look at this. Yeah,
so I mean, the reality is that for most people, most of their day to day, well, I don't know, in most corporate environments, I would say most office workers, most people who work in the knowledge economy, are tend to spend most of their time and more of their time at that complex, uncertain end of the spectrum. And what we find is that by kind of defaulting to practices at that end of the spectrum, teams immediately start to see a lot of value, and those practices apply very, very broadly. And the work that is still certain, basically most companies are already really good at that, and they don't need a lot of help in improving that.
Here's the question you get paid to answer, because I'm listening to this and going, this is great thinking, and I'm probably not alone. I'm sure there are listeners out there thinking the same thing. The question you get paid to answer is, well, what are we supposed to do with this knowledge? First, to the individual who's trying to make their own work life better, what can they do with understanding this? But also to the entire organization or to the managers, what can they do to reduce some of the frustration that we're all feeling in the workplace?
Yeah, so our work and what we deliver and coach with our clients, we draw inspiration from a lot of great sources and methods. Agile software development as a methodology is a good example. Lean startup is another good example, and many others. And we try to adapt those to be really practical and useful things, useful practices that anyone in any organization doing any kind of work can pick up pretty quickly and try with their teams. And I'll give you a couple examples.
Sure.
Some are more complex than others. I'll share a couple with you that are relatively simple, and I hopefully will be a little bit easier to understand in just audio format.
Okay.
So one example is a practice that we call rounds. And all it is simply letting each person in a meeting speak one at a time in turn without interruption. And it's really, that sounds super simple. It is actually that simple. And what's kind of funny and sometimes a little bit sad is that it is actually revolutionary in most corporate environments. How often, I don't know how long it's been since you've been in a meeting inside a typical corporation, but the norm is that conversations are dominated by the loudest voice in the room. Sure. Or dominated by the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, and they don't, certain people don't have a chance to make their voice heard or to add their 2 cents, and you miss out on a lot of really useful perspective and potentially really critical information when that happens. And so this is something that a team would just call out and say, hey, let's do a round on this. We just shared this idea. We'd like to hear from everyone about what you think of it. Let's do a round. And you just let each person speak without interrupting each other. Another example is something we refer to as working in public. And this is a little bit more software and technology driven. It's about moving all of your collaborative work to web-based shared documents like Google Docs. Mm-hmm. So internally, for instance, at August, all of our documents, everything that we work on, lives in shared folders that are always accessible to all other August team members. So no one has any personal docs that just sit on their desktop and other people don't have access to. Yeah. Everything lives in these shared folders. And when we create a new document, we share links to our work in progress from the moment the file is created, rather than waiting until it's finished or we feel like it's ready to share.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, and that I can see being the future, because my kids right now, that's what they do for their homework, and they're working on it, and the teacher can view it at any time.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Yeah.
That's interesting, fascinating. In these rounds, let me ask you this: in these rounds, because I was just in a big meeting. I think there were, I don't know, 9 of us this morning. Of course, I was in through WebEx, but in these meetings with rounds, do you go in order, or is it like when you're ready to go, you raise your hand, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there are different styles, and it depends on what you want to do. Like we think of one type of round that's very common is a reaction round, where it's like somebody shared something that they want to do or presented some idea or proposal, and you do a reaction round. And in that case, you typically, you deliberately ask for each person's reaction, and you go one at a time and you hear from everyone, and you go around in a circle so people know when to go. Another type could be something like asking clarifying questions, like does anybody have any questions about this, and that you could do. There's another phrase that we like to use, facilitator language, is popcorn style. Just as people have a question, they can call it out. And you keep going until the popcorn stops popping.
Interesting. And do you get punished if you interrupt somebody?
Well, hopefully a facilitator is useful for this.
Yeah.
If a team has been doing this kind of stuff together, you barely need any facilitation because everyone kind of knows the rules of the game. But if you have a group where this is new to people, then it's useful to have one person designated as a facilitator who, when someone interrupts, because they're the facilitator, they kind of have permission to call that person out and say, "Oh, please don't interrupt. Let's wait for this person to be finished."
Yeah. I love how sometimes the most simple practices, clarifications, have the biggest results. It's fascinating. I was just thinking as you were talking, what are some of the reactions, outcomes, results you've seen from companies or teams that you've worked with? Are we just talking about alleviating frustration, or I mean, where does this lie on the result spectrum?
Yeah. So it's the fun thing is that turns out that this is very results oriented. Really, especially in a corporate environment, this is really about letting teams get shit done. And that again is like surprisingly revolutionary. It's shocking how hard it is for people and for teams in corporate environments to get stuff done. And this really unlocks a lot of productivity in a very engaging way for most of the teams who practice it. Like one example that we had from a client, they were trying to do some consumer research, and they were telling us after they had kind of gone through this and used some of these new methods for how they were operating as a team, they were able to get this research into the field in about 6 weeks. And they told us that normally it would have taken 6 months or more to get that research into the field because of all the bureaucracy, all of the reviews, how slow things normally work. And other things, people within teams, individuals feel like they have more autonomy to make decisions. They have more alignment about their team's priorities and who's going to do what. More clarity about their role and what's expected of them. And also just feeling like their voice is heard, both literally and figuratively, that they have more agency to actually make an impact in the work that they're doing.
Nice. Good stuff, Mike. I had checked out some of your speeches that you've given online. You've got quite a few videos out there, and you got some good stuff. This is not only is this your job, but you do also give speeches on the kind of the stuff you're talking about, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We love to do talks and talk about this stuff and share these ideas with any audience who's interested. So always interested in hearing about opportunities for that.
Mike, it's been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. If listeners want to learn more about you or August, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, so visit our company's website at aug.co. That's aug.co. You can sign up for a weekly newsletter that we have. And I would also encourage people to check out our public Google Drive, where you'll find a lot of interesting stuff, including my salary and our revenue and fun stuff like that, where we take transparency pretty seriously. So, and you can check that out at public.aug.co.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for being here today, Mike.
All right. Thanks.
What did you think of today's show? The conversation continues on www.octanner.com. Be sure to leave us a comment. Also, remember to rate, review, and subscribe to all our podcasts on iTunes. Now get out there and build something beautiful. It's your turn now.